Okay, we're in Isaiah 23, and I'm going to start with a poem that a lot of you probably studied when you were in school, and it's by Shelley. All right, Percy Shelley, and it's called Ozymandias. So, I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." I just always loved that poem. And I think it's because of what it says in terms of, the irony, this symbol that was supposed to represent power and wealth and success, that over time had just been totally wiped away. Everything was wiped away except for the boast. And the boast seemed ridiculous in light of what remained, which was nothing. And so he always, the way that my English teacher, Miss Harn, Judy Harn, had explained it was, this statue was this symbol of wealth. And think about what are some symbols of wealth that we have culturally? Wall Street. I think of that bull. That sculpture of the bull, that's certainly a symbol of wealth. New York City is a symbol of wealth. Think about some of the even retail establishments. They're symbols of wealth. If you've got an L, all right, interlocked into a V, Louis Vuitton. The C's, the two backward C's, Coco Chanel. I mean, you've got these designers that have created these symbols of wealth and status. And so really what we're going to be talking about in chapter 23 is a city that has become a symbol of wealth in the ancient world, and really what they say represents power versus what God says represents power. So chapters, we've done a big jump to get to chapter 23. Chapters 13 through 23 are what they call the oracles of nations. And this is where Isaiah comes in, and he gives a whole series of prophecies about judgments that are going to be occurring against some of these ancient cultures. Like there's a judgment against Babylon that he talks about, against Moab, against Damascus, Cush, which is Nubia, all right, down in Africa, Egypt, Jerusalem. And the last one he gives is against the city of Tyre, Tyre. Now, as a Southerner, I pronounce it with two syllables, Tyre, okay? And that's probably not right, but it just is hard to get out. It's hard to get out of my system. But he gives these oracles as a means to remind people, God's people, and the surrounding nations, that really, God is reigning. God is sovereign. God is in control. And he may use pagan nations as agents of punishment against other cities or cultures, even against his own people. But ultimately, they are going to face accountability too. And so that's where we find ourselves with chapter 23, where Isaiah starts to talk about Tyre and its destruction. So I'm going to read verses 1 through 7, and then we're going to get a little information about Tyre from those verses. Wail, O ships of Tarshish, for Tyre is destroyed, without house or harbor. It's reported to them from the land of Cyprus. Be silent, you inhabitants of the coastland, you merchants of Sidon. Your messengers crossed the sea and were on many waters. The grain of the Nile, the harvest of the river was her revenue, and she was the market of nations. Be ashamed, O Sidon, for the sea speaks, the stronghold of the sea, saying, I have neither travailed nor given birth. I have neither brought up young men nor reared virgins. When the report reaches Egypt, they will be in anguish at the report of Tyre. Pass over to Tarshish. Wail, O inhabitants of the coastland. Is this your jubilant city, whose origin is from antiquity, whose feet used to carry her to colonize distant places? That's Tyre in the future. So this is, a picture of what is going to ultimately happen to Tyre. And as soon as I read that, I kept thinking of Ozymandias, because it's like there's nothing left. But obviously, from the description that we get, at some point, or at the point where Isaiah is giving this prophecy, Tyre is a city that has enormous impact on that region. It was a Phoenician city. It was a great commercial center settled on the Mediterranean. It was actually the commercial center of the Mediterranean Sea. And I love in verse 3, it says she was the market of nations. I keep getting the picture of Mall of America. Okay. That's kind of like Tyre was the mall of the Mediterranean. Everybody wanted to go and shop in Tyre. That was, it was a big deal if you're getting goods that are coming through Tyre. So it was the commercial center, kind of like New York has been the commercial center for the United States for a number of years. So because Tyre was on the sea, on the Mediterranean, then her ships went out to places all over that region. And so when we see in verse 1 that there's a reference to Tarshish, O ships of Tarshish, that's really hard to say, by the way, Tarshish. Tarshish was in the southern part of Spain, and you may recognize that that's where Jonah wanted to run to when he didn't want to go to Nineveh. Which I've always heard Spain is an absolutely gorgeous place to go. I can understand picking that. But when he's talking about those ships of Tarshish, those are actually not ships coming, that are belonged by Tarshish. They're ships that are from Tyre that have made it that far. So it's talking about the expanse of Tyre's influence. These are these trading ships that had made it that far to Spain. And they were ships that were the biggest and most impressive ships in the ancient world. We see that they went down the Nile. If you go back and you look in verse 3, the grain of the Nile, the harvest of a river, was part of her commerce, was part of her cargo. So it was definitely something, a community that had enormous impact and influence. And when you have someone or something that is part of the center of other people's worlds, when it's suddenly pulled out, there's a giant hole. And it certainly leaves more than just a ripple effect. It can be a tsunami effect. And so if something happened to Tyre, then that's kind of the effect that you're going to have. Even more, people couldn't imagine that something could happen to Tyre, because if you look at verse 4, it describes it, the stronghold of the sea. All right, so it didn't have just one harbor. Tyre actually had 2 harbors, and the city was set up so part of it was on the island, and part was on the mainland. So it had actually kind of a double protection, okay? Because you've got the island sitting out there like a citadel, a sentry, guarding the mainland part of the city. The island was very rocky, so that area was hard to navigate. They could have used it certainly as a fortress. But then if you got past the island and made it to the mainland portion, they actually had a 150-foot wall around that part of the city. So it was fortified. As a matter of fact, Joshua talks about it in Joshua 19. He calls it the fortified city. So it was like a stronghold. There was no idea that this place could be defeated. And more, why would anybody want to? Because everybody had something invested in Tyre. So the destruction of Tyre was going to be a shock. And it was going to be a shock financially and otherwise. So what he actually predicts in the prophecy, it says that her harbors are closed. It says that her borders are desolate. It says that her sea has been abandoned. It says that Egypt, who was her ally, is afraid. I mean, this is mighty Egypt that is afraid. Who on earth is going to do that to Tyre? Well, that's the question. And the answer is, it's nobody on earth who's going to do that to Tyre. So let's look at verses 8 through 12, where we get a picture of God's justice and what it looks like in the case of Tyre. Who has planned this against Tyre, the bestower of crowns, whose merchants were princes, whose traders were the honored of the earth? The Lord of hosts has planned it, to defile the pride of all beauty, to despise all the honored of the earth. Overflow your land like the Nile, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no more restraint. He has stretched his hand out over the sea. He has made the kingdoms tremble. The Lord has given a command concerning Canaan to demolish its strongholds. He has said, you shall exult no more, O crushed virgin daughter of Sidon. Arise, pass over to Cyprus. Even there you will find no rest. So notice in verse 8, there's a verb, planned. Who has planned this? So y'all, what happens to Tyre isn't arbitrary. It's calculated. All right, there is a design behind it. And we discover in later verses that it's actually a cause and effect situation. Tyre thought they were invincible because, after all, it says they were the bestower of crowns. Y'all, this city was a kingmaker. They were the ones who created the rich and the powerful. They had a reputation of renown. Yet even they were not immune from being accountable to God. So verse 9 tells us the answer. Who has planned this? Who on earth? No. Who? God. Lord of hosts. And we know that that idea, the Lord of hosts, we aren't talking the cute little cherubs and, their little arrows and kind of this, we get a weak vision of angels in popular culture. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about angel armies. We're talking about fierce warriors and just multitudes of warriors. So the God of hosts, the Lord of hosts, the head of angel armies has done this. And that's a title that shows power. And it's power that's much greater than any power that Tyre ever dreamed of. And why? Well, we also get that answer in verse 9. To defile the pride of all beauty. Now, if I had thought, okay, why might he take down Tyre after looking at those first 7 verses, I might have thought, well, they're probably greedy. But it's not even the greed that's the worst thing. What is the sin that brings them down? Pride. Pride is the sin that brings them down. So it angered God more than their greed. So we tend today not to think of pride as a really bad thing. Okay, like I remember, as a matter of fact, I should have gone to find it. Somewhere I have a t-shirt that says, I am the center of Irmo Pride. Pride, Pride, okay? And there were a lot of Gamecocks last night who had their pride hurt. Pride we tend to think of as a positive thing. What's the difference between when we're talking about godly pride and ungodly pride? Like you might have pride in your children. Most of the time, when we're talking about pride in our children, it's not something we've done. We're proud of who God created them to be. And godly pride recognizes the source of those good things. When we're talking about ungodly pride, most of the time it's because ungodly pride says, we've done this ourselves. And you choke yourself, patting yourself on the back. So that's ungodly pride. Because ungodly pride most of the time makes us the object of worship. It puts us at the center. And God is going to humble mankind when they do that. Because he alone is the one who is worthy and the object of worship. And we're all going to know that one day. And Tyre is going to learn it a little sooner than some other kingdoms that Isaiah talked about. Ultimately, we know that when his kingdom comes, his will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that God is going to take every nation and he's going to bring down every proud nation. And y'all, most nations have a sense of national pride. But where does the pride come from? Is the pride coming from the fact that they are a God-ordained and God-serving and obedient to God community? Or does that pride come from a sense of, we did it, we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps? And if it's the second kind, then God promises that nation is not going to stand. Which is why yesterday's event, I think, was so critical for our country. All right, so verses 10 through 12 gives us a picture of the response of the nations when they hear about what happens to Tyre. And it really is for them the end of a secure world. And I think that's part of, to really understand how unsettling that is, I think we could take it and we could look at what's happening now in our country and around the world. Really what we're feeling is something that most of us haven't experienced quite so much in our lifetime. I would say probably World War II they did. But this is the first time that most of us have really felt like that there's no place of security in this world. And I think that's what's so unsettling to so many people. And it just reinforces to us as believers that we cannot depend on things or people or nations of this world for our security. It can't be done because they will not stand. The only thing that stands is the Word of God. And the only thing we can depend on is God Himself. So what is the response in the ancient world when they hear of the destruction of Tyre? Well, it's no different than what most of us would experience if we heard of the destruction of Canada, okay? Or what most people, I think, felt when we had the September 11th attacks in New York City. It shook people. In verse 10, well, it says that Spain is no longer under Tyre's dominion and domination. It says, flood, overflow your land like the Nile. Do what you wish. So those that have been under the thumb of Tyre are going to run haywire, run wild. Verse 11, He has made kingdoms tremble. Kingdoms around the Mediterranean are going to lose their financial footing because of their dependence on Tyre. Verse 11, where it says He's given a command concerning Canaan to demolish its strongholds. The fortresses will fall. All of Canaan will be judged because of their rebellion. Kind of sounds like Joshua's time. I kept thinking of their strongholds falling. And verse 12, you shall exalt no more, O crushed virgin daughter of Sidon. Y'all, that's a graphic image of violence. I mean, basically, they're talking about that these lands are going to be raped and exploited. And people who try to flee aren't going to be able to find anywhere to go. Because it seems like the whole world has lost its footing. The reminder is that God is just and will hold everyone, every nation accountable to His holy standard at the time He decides. And it's just as true today as it was in the ancient time. So, we know that God is just and that justice is a part of His sovereignty. We know that God is active. In verses 13 and 14, we see that. Behold, the land of the Chaldeans. This is the people which was not. Assyria appointed it for desert creatures. They erected their siege towers. They stripped its palaces. They made it a ruin. Wail, O ships of Tarshish, for your stronghold is destroyed. And he throws out in verse 13 as evidence that what God decrees will come to pass. Isaiah gives us the Chaldeans as an example, and that's Babylonia, okay? There are people who no longer exist at the time where he's giving this prophecy. They have been overrun by the Assyrians, which is interesting because the Assyrians are who God is going to use later down the line for judgment on Tyre. And again, it's not that God thinks the Assyrians are holy and he's using them. They're an agent. And ultimately, they're going to be accountable also. And in verse 14, we see that refrain repeated, that the impact of God's action has this effect beyond Tyre. And the wailing, the sorrow, the agony that comes from the loss in all kinds of ways from the destruction of this city. So God is active. We've seen it before, he says. He's going to do it again. And then ultimately, why does he destroy Tyre? Well, because ultimately God is going to be honored in some way, shape, or form. So 15 through 18. Now in that day, Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, like the days of one king. At the end of 70 years, it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the harlot. Take your harp, walk about the city, O forgotten harlot. Pluck the strings skillfully. Sing many songs that you may be remembered. It will come about at the end of 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre. Then she will go back to her harlot's wages and will play the harlot with all the kingdoms on the face of the earth. Her gain and her harlot's wages will be set apart to the Lord. I'm going to read that again, and I'm going to change the emphasis of the verb. Her gain and her harlot's wages will be set apart to the Lord. It will not be stored up or hoarded, but her gain will become sufficient food and choice attire for those who dwell in the presence of the Lord. So while Isaiah doesn't give a specific time for Tyre's destruction, we do know that it's going to be a non-player for about 70 years, the lifespan of a king, okay? So he's going to take, after God comes in and destroys Tyre, then it's going to be taken off of the world stage for 70 years. And at the end of those 70 years, it tells us in verses 16 and 17 that she'll be back at her old tricks. And I use that term on purpose because we see a comparison. Tyre is compared to a harlot, to a prostitute. And this city is going to be prosperous once again, but it's going to be a little worse for wear. And it hasn't learned its lesson. Okay? Just like a prostitute that's been taken off the streets and put in the pokey for a while, finds herself back on the streets, trying to use what she's got, hadn't learned her lesson. And it really paints a picture of what dishonoring God looks like. And what does it look like? Well, you're selling little parts of yourself for gain, for personal gain. And that's self-absorption. And again, that's putting I and me at the center. And who is supposed to be at the center? God is supposed to be at the center. And anything that takes him off that throne is an idol. So we see that self-absorption. We see that preoccupation with what I want in the city of Tyre, even after going through the destruction. So, verse 18, we see that Isaiah describes a time when Tyre's fortunes won't be hoarded for herself. And I thought it was really interesting because it says that her gain will become sufficient food and choice attire for those who dwell in the presence of the Lord. So at some point, there's going to be some benefit to the kingdom that's coming out of Tyre. And so, y'all, it's interesting because it talks about the Lord visiting Tyre in Isaiah. Well, y'all, Jesus went to Tyre. In Matthew 15, it says that he goes to Tyre, and that's where he healed the Canaanite woman that's possessed by the demons. So Jesus goes to Tyre. And at that point, isn't Tyre being used for the benefit of the kingdom? Absolutely. Paul goes to Tyre. In Acts chapter 21, Luke talks about going to Tyre and Paul finding disciples there. So there's a Christian community that has grown up in Tyre. Benefit of the kingdom. Even in the Old Testament, God uses Tyre to benefit of the kingdom. Remember Cyrus? During the time of Ezra, when they were rebuilding the temple, Cyrus orders Tyre to supply the materials to rebuild the temple. The benefit of the kingdom. And then in Psalm 45, where it's talking about the millennial kingdom, thy kingdom come. Israel is the bride of Christ, and the daughter of Tyre, mentioned by name, daughter of Tyre, is among those who rejoice in Israel's blessing and brings gifts to the king. So Tyre has a purpose. So why would God restore Tyre after destroying it? Because he will be honored. He's going to use Tyre, and it's going to show honor to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now, those earlier ones, it may have been through compulsion, but ultimately, they're not going to have any choice but to recognize who's really in charge. So I think this is a good reminder for us of what our attitude should be towards success and wealth, because I think there's a pretty clear lesson from Tyre. Things don't last, and it doesn't matter what brands you buy. Ultimately, those things are going to be destroyed. And it doesn't matter how much of you accumulate, you are not taking it with you. And you may leave it as a legacy to your children, and that's great, but they aren't taking it with them either. The only thing that lasts is what we invest in terms of the kingdom. That's it. So how does God view wealth? And shouldn't our view be like his? It should match. As a believer, as someone who's obedient to God, as somebody who wants to have the mind of Christ, then my view of wealth and success needs to match God's view. Y'all, God is against pride. He is definitely not thrilled when we live our life in a way that says we're more important than others. And God is not impressed with worldliness. We spend a lot of time trying to impress. For example, I was watching a TV show, and it was talking about, it was actually a trip to Italy. It was kind of interesting. It's these two guys that travel around and they do restaurant reviews as a part of this movie. And there was a person who drove up in the Mercedes, and the people were they responded differently because of the car than they did to these two guys who were actually the restaurant reviewers, who drove up, and I don't even know what it was, like a Mini Cooper, but it was like Mini Cooper. The little tiny one that you could pick up and put on the sidewalk. Y'all, the things that are impressive to the world don't impress God. In fact, sometimes we have to be exactly the opposite. It's not the outside that God cares about, it's the heart. We need to make sure that we learn our lessons. Tyre did not learn its lesson through the suffering. It's not going to learn its lesson. Do we learn lessons through our suffering? God's got something to teach us when the bad things happen. In the midst of this mess, 2020, a year that stinks, what is God teaching us? Are we learning the lessons that God would have us learn? But I think the most important one is the last one, is that there's nobody that's beyond hope. Because Tyre is there at the end rejoicing at the wedding of Christ and his bride. Nobody's beyond hope. Except Ozymandias. We don't want to be him. I don't ever want to be one of these people where people remember me for things. And if I die with nothing, that's okay, as long as I've invested what I have, my time, any dollars that God chooses to bless me with, as long as I invest it in things that are going to have eternal rewards. I want to see my life show up in a different way in eternity.